They said it was impossible, that the bank always wins, but in Harmony, Texas, a group of quilting ladies was about to prove them all wrong. What nobody expected was that their stitched masterpiece would hold the key to saving their community. The impossible had already happened 3 times that scorching August afternoon in Silver Lake, Texas. First, when 40 Boeing engineers admitted defeat after 3 weeks of futile attempts. Second, when billionaire Thaddeus Crockford's $250 million private jet remained as silent and stubborn as a mule in the hangar. Third, when 12-year-old Claire Duncan quietly slipped past the security tape with nothing but her mother's worn toolbox and a confident smile that would soon wipe the smirk off the most arrogant man in America. What nobody expected was that the fourth impossible thing would change everything they thought they knew about genius, prejudice, and the power of underestimating a small-town girl with grease under her fingernails. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Heat shimmered off the concrete runway at Silver Lake Regional Airport, creating waves that made the distant pine trees dance like mirages. Claire adjusted her grip on the heavy toolbox, its leather handle worn smooth by her mother's calloused hands over 20 years of aircraft maintenance. The metal latches clicked softly as she walked, a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat during countless afternoons spent watching Wendy Duncan work magic on broken engines. "You shouldn't be here, sweetheart." Dale Peterson emerged from the shade of the hangar, his airport maintenance uniform dark with sweat stains. His weathered face creased with concern as he spotted the young girl approaching the restricted area. "This whole section's been cordoned off for weeks now, nothing but fancy engineers and frustrated billionaires stomping around, making everyone's life miserable." Claire stopped just outside the yellow security tape, her blue eyes scanning the massive hangar beyond. Through the open doors, she could see the sleek white fuselage of Crockford's Gulfstream 650, its engine cowlings removed to expose the complex machinery within. Men in crisp shirts and khaki pants clustered around laptops and diagnostic equipment, their voices carrying across the space in frustrated murmurs. "I know I shouldn't be here, Mr. Peterson," she said, setting the toolbox down carefully, "but Mom's working a double shift at the commercial terminal, and I was hoping to maybe learn something by watching. She always says the best education comes from seeing real problems get solved." Dale's expression softened. He'd known Claire since she was 6 years old when Wendy first brought her daughter to work during summer breaks. Even then, the kid had shown an uncanny ability to spot mechanical issues that escaped the notice of seasoned professionals. "That's a mighty expensive problem in there, little miss, worth more than most folks in Silver Lake will see in 10 lifetimes. Money doesn't make engines any less complicated," Claire replied, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. "Mom always says metal and pistons don't care how much someone paid for them. They either work right or they don't." From inside the hangar came the sound of raised voices. Dr. Gregory Allen, the lead Boeing engineer, was speaking in clipped professional tones to someone on his cellular phone. His team had been working around the clock, running diagnostic after diagnostic. But the Pratt & Whitney engine continued to defy their understanding. 3 weeks of overtime, computer modeling, and increasingly desperate troubleshooting had yielded nothing but mounting frustration, and a billionaire client whose patience had evaporated days ago. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Allen was saying into his phone, pacing near the aircraft's port engine. "We've eliminated every possible cause in our manual. The compression readings are perfect. Fuel delivery system is pristine. Ignition timing is precisely calibrated. Yet, the engine produces less than 60.0% power output during climb phase." Claire found herself leaning forward, straining to catch every word. The problem sounded familiar somehow, like an echo of something her mother had encountered before. Wendy had spent 15 years working on commercial aircraft before taking the job at Silver Lake Regional, and she brought home stories of mysterious engine anomalies that stumped entire maintenance crews. "The client is threatening to sue Boeing for the full replacement cost of the aircraft," Dr. Allen continued, "plus damages for 3 weeks of delayed business. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions in liability." Thaddeus Crockford himself appeared from behind the aircraft, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the hangar. At 52, he possessed the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the Texas heat, and his expensive polo shirt remained crisp and unwrinkled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as gospel. "I don't want to hear about precedents or manuals," he declared, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I want solutions. This aircraft cost me $240 million, and I expect it to function perfectly. I have board meetings in New York, contracts to sign in London, and a merger to finalize in Tokyo. Every day, this machine sits broken, cost me more money than your entire team makes in a year." Nicole Murphy, a young Boeing engineer fresh out of MIT, looked up from her laptop screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. clearly intimidated by Rockford's presence. Sir, we've run every possible test. The engine components are functioning within normal parameters individually, but something is causing a power loss during sustained climb operations. It's almost like there's an intermittent restriction somewhere in the system. Rockford's laugh was cold and dismissive, almost like I pay for certainty, for expertise, for results. If your team can't solve this problem, maybe I need to find engineers who actually understand how aircraft work, Doctor. Alan stepped forward, his professional demeanor barely concealing his growing frustration. Mr. Rockford, with respect, this is an extremely complex system. Sometimes anomalies require time to identify and resolve. We're dealing with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, pressures calculated to precise decimals. Spare me the technical lecture, Rockford snapped. I've been told this aircraft represents the pinnacle of engineering excellence. Yet here it sits, broken, surrounded by supposedly brilliant minds who can't figure out why it will climb properly. Maybe the problem isn't the machine. Maybe the problem is that I'm stuck in this godforsaken backwater town with mechanics who learned their trade working on crop dusters. The insult hung in the air like exhaust fumes, accurate and poisonous. Several of the Boeing engineers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing the unfairness of Rockford's attack on the local community. But none of them spoke up. Their jobs depended on keeping this client satisfied regardless of his behavior. Dale Peterson, however, felt no such constraint. He stepped closer to the security tape, his jaw tightening. Now, just hold on there, mister. The folks in Silver Lake might not have fancy degrees hanging on their walls, but we know aircraft maintenance as well as anyone. Wendy Duncan, who works right here at this airport, has forgotten more about engines than most people ever learn. Rockford turned toward the hangar entrance, his gaze fixing on Dale with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for insects. And who exactly are you to speak about aircraft expertise? Let me guess. You change light bulbs and sweep floors. I'm the man who keeps this airport running while you stand around insulting people who've never done you any harm. Dale replied evenly, and that young lady behind me has spent more time around aircraft than most of your engineers have spent in classrooms. For the first time, Rockford noticed Claire standing outside the security perimeter. His expression shifted from dismissive to genuinely amused, as if he'd just discovered an entertaining joke. A child? You're suggesting that a child might have insights into a problem that stumped 40 professional engineers? Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. I'm 12, and I've been learning about aircraft engines since I could hold a wrench. My mom's been teaching me how systems work together, how problems in one area can affect performance in others. Rockford's amusement deepened into something approaching cruelty. How charming. Tell me, little girl, what do you think is wrong with my $250 million aircraft? Have you diagnosed the problem from behind that security tape? The mocking tone should have intimidated Claire, should have sent her running back toward the terminal with tears in her eyes. Instead, something crystallized in her mind. A memory of her mother explaining how certain engine problems could hide behind normal-looking diagnostic readings. Wendy had encountered a similar issue years ago on a commercial airliner. A problem that had required looking beyond the obvious symptoms. I think maybe you've got a partial blockage in your bleed air system, Claire said quietly. Something small enough that it doesn't show up on ground tests, but big enough to affect climb performance when the engine's working at full capacity. The hangar fell completely silent. Dr. Allen stopped pacing. Nicole Murphy looked up from her computer screen. Even Crockford's smirk faltered slightly as he processed what the child had just suggested. Bleed air system, Dr. Allen repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. We tested the bleed air valves during our initial diagnostics. All readings were normal. But did you test them under simulated climb conditions? Claire asked, her confidence growing despite the weight of 40 professional stares focused on her. My mom says sometimes blockages only show up when the system's under stress, like when the engine's trying to climb and maintain cabin pressure at the same time. Nicole Murphy's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the diagnostic data from 3 weeks of testing. Her eyes widened as she scanned through screens of information. We tested bleed airflow at ground level with engines at various power settings, but we never simulated the specific pressure differentials that occur during sustained climb operations. Dr. Allen moved closer to Nicole's workstation, studying the data over her shoulder. If there's a partial obstruction in one of the secondary bleed air lines, it wouldn't necessarily show up in our standard tests, but during climb, when the engine's working harder and the cabin pressurization system is drawing maximum airflow, the restriction would become significant enough to affect overall engine performance. Nicole finished, her voice rising with excitement. It's so simple, but we never thought to test those specific conditions. Crawford's expression had shifted from amusement to something approaching shock. He looked at Claire as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her rather than simply dismissing her as an irrelevant child. You're suggesting that a 12-year-old girl has identified a problem that 40 Boeing engineers missed. I'm suggesting that sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced eyes overlook. Claire replied, my mom always says that the simplest explanation is usually the right one, especially when all the complicated explanations don't work. Dr. Allen was already moving toward the aircraft, his professional skepticism wearing with genuine curiosity. It would take about an hour to run the proper tests. We'd need to simulate climb conditions while monitoring bleed airflow rates in real time. Then do it, Rockford commanded, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. And if this child is right, if she's identified something that your entire team missed, then I'll want to know how that's possible. As the engineers began preparing their equipment for a new round of testing, Claire felt a mixture of pride and nervousness settling in her stomach. She'd spoken up because the problem had seemed so clear to her, so obvious based on everything her mother had taught her about engines. But now, watching 40 professionals scramble to test her theory, she realized the magnitude of what she'd just done. Dale Peterson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Your mama's going to be mighty proud when she hears about this. Sweetheart, mighty proud indeed. Through the changer's open doors, Claire could see the Boeing team connecting additional monitoring equipment to the Gulfstream's engines. Dr. Allen was issuing rapid instructions to his colleagues, his earlier frustration replaced by the focused energy of someone pursuing a promising lead. Nicole Murphy kept glancing toward the hangar entrance, as if she couldn't quite believe that the breakthrough they'd been seeking had come from a 12-year-old girl with a worn toolbox. But Thaddeus that Rockford remained standing near the aircraft's nose, his gaze fixed on Claire with an expression that was difficult to read. The arrogant dismissal was gone, replaced by something that might have been calculation, or perhaps the first stirring of genuine curiosity about the young girl who had just challenged everything he thought he knew about expertise and intelligence. As the afternoon sun continued its relentless assault on the Texas landscape, the impossible was about to happen for the fourth time in Silver Lake. And this time, everyone in that hangar would be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that genius doesn't always arrive in the package society expects. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The diagnostic equipment hummed to life with electronic precision, filling the hangar with the steady rhythm of computerized analysis. Dr. Allen supervised the connection of additional sensors to the Gulfstream's port engine, while Nicole Murphy calibrated pressure monitoring systems that would simulate the exact conditions encountered during sustained climbs to 37. Fort Claire watched from beyond the security tape, her toolbox forgotten at her feet as she absorbed every detail of the professional testing procedure. The Boeing engineers moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing exactly which systems to monitor and how to configure the sophisticated machinery that surrounded Rockford's aircraft like electronic ivy. Initializing cabin pressurization simulation, announced Brad Wilson, a senior engineer whose gray beard spoke of decades spent troubleshooting complex mechanical systems. His fingers danced across a tablet interface, adjusting parameters that would trick the aircraft's computers into believing they were climbing through increasingly thin atmosphere. Wendy Duncan appeared in the hangar entrance, her blue maintenance jumpsuit bearing the familiar stains of hydraulic fluid and engine oil. Her shift at the commercial terminal had ended early when a delayed flight canceled its arrival, giving her an unexpected opportunity to check on her daughter. The sight of Claire standing so close to Rockford's aircraft sent a jolt of protective concern through her tired mind. Claire Elizabeth Duncan, what on earth are you doing here? Wendy's voice carried the particular tone that mothers reserve for children found in places they absolutely should not be. This is a restricted area, and you know better than to wander around where you don't belong. Dale Peterson intervened before Claire could respond, his expression mixing respect and amazement. Wendy, you need to hear what your daughter just did. She might have solved their engine problem when 40 Boeing engineers couldn't figure it out. Wendy's skeptical expression softened into confusion as she looked between Dale and the cluster of professionals surrounding the aircraft. What are you talking about? What problem? The billionaire's jet has been producing reduced power during climbs, Dale explained. 3 weeks they've been testing everything under the sun, and Claire suggested it might be a bleed air restriction that only shows up under specific pressure conditions. Dr. Allen approached the group, his professional demeanor noticeably more respectful than it had been an hour earlier. Mrs. Duncan, I assume your daughter has proposed a theory that we're about to test. If she's correct, she's identified something that our entire diagnostic protocol missed. Wendy's eyes widened as she processed the implications. She brought Claire to the airport countless times over the years, sharing her knowledge of aircraft systems and encouraging her daughter's natural mechanical aptitude. But the idea that 12-year-old Claire had outsmarted a team of Boeing's finest engineers seemed almost impossible to accept. Mom, I just remembered what you told me about that American Airlines flight in Dallas, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, the one where the climb performance was off because of a partial blockage that didn't show up until the cabin pressurization system was working at maximum capacity. The memory clicked into place for Wendy with startling clarity. Flight for 7 years ago, when she had been part of the maintenance crew that eventually discovered a microscopic piece of debris in a secondary bleed airline. The problem had taken 2 weeks to identify because it only manifested under very specific operational conditions. Sweet Jesus, Wendy breathed, her hand moving to her daughter's shoulder. You think they might have the same issue? Beginning climb simulation now, Nicole announced from her workstation. Multiple computer screens displayed real-time data streams showing engine performance, bleed airflow rates, and cabin pressurization levels. The Gulfstream's engines responded to the electronic commands, increasing power output while sophisticated sensors monitored every aspect of their operation. Thaddeus Rockford positioned himself near the monitoring station, his earlier arrogance replaced by intense focus. The financial implications of this test were staggering. If the child was right, his aircraft could be returned to service within hours. If she was wrong, he'd wasted another day pursuing a theory suggested by someone young enough to require parental permission for a field trip. Bleed airflow showing normal parameters at simulated 1504. Brad Wilson reported, his eyes scanning multiple data readouts simultaneously, cabin pressurization system engaging as programmed. The hangar filled with the subdued roar of engines operating at climbing power, their sound muffled by sophisticated noise-dampening equipment. Claire found herself holding her breath as the test progressed. Her confidence in the theory wearing with the very real possibility that she'd embarrassed herself in front of people whose expertise dwarfed her own limited knowledge. 25-0 simulation, Nicole called out, still showing normal flow rates across all bleed air circuits. Dr. Allen frowned at his tablet display, noting that engine performance remained within expected parameters. If Claire's theory was correct, they should be seeing some indication of restriction by this altitude. Perhaps the child's suggestion had been nothing more than an educated guess that happened to sound plausible. 30-0, Brad announced, cabin pressure differential reaching maximum operational levels. Suddenly, Nicole's computer screen erupted with warning indicators. I'm showing a significant drop in secondary bleed airflow, she exclaimed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to capture the anomalous readings. Flow rate has decreased by nearly 30.0% in the past 60 seconds, Dr. Allen rushed to Nicole's workstation, his eyes widening as he studied the data streaming across her monitor. There it is, he said, his voice filled with professional amazement. A restriction that only becomes significant when the system's operating at maximum differential pressure. Wendy squeezed Claire's shoulder, her pride in her daughter's insight mixing with astonishment at the accuracy of the diagnosis. How did you know to look there, sweetheart? It just made sense. Claire replied, her cheeks flushing with a combination of relief and excitement. When they said the engine was producing normal power on the ground, but losing performance during climbs, it sounded exactly like what you described with that American Airlines flight. Thaddeus Rockford approached the Duncan family with measured steps, his entire demeanor transformed from the dismissive arrogance he displayed earlier. For a man accustomed to commanding every situation through wealth and influence, the experience of being proven wrong by a 12-year-old girl required significant mental adjustment. Young lady, he began, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that surprised everyone within earshot. It appears you've accomplished something that a team of highly paid professionals could not. How do you explain that? Claire looked up at the billionaire, no longer intimidated by his imposing presence. I think sometimes being an outsider helps you see things differently. The engineers were looking at all the complex possibilities, but Mom taught me to start with simple explanations and work up to complicated ones. Identifying the restriction location now, Brad Wilson announced from his position near the engine, appears to be in the secondary bleed air manifold. Probably a foreign object or debris accumulation that's created a partial obstruction. Dr. Allen was already calculating repair timelines in his head. If it's accessible through the inspection panels, we could have this resolved within 4 hours. Complete system flush and inspection. Replacement of any contaminated components. Crawford's relief was visible as the prospect of getting his aircraft operational again became a reality. 3 weeks of delays had cost him several important business opportunities, and the mounting pressure from his board of directors had been increasing daily. But beyond the financial implications, something else was happening in his mind. A grudging recognition that his assumptions about intelligence and expertise might need serious revision. Mrs. Duncan, he said, turning to Wendy, your daughter has saved me considerable time and money today. I'd like to express my gratitude in a tangible way. Wendy's expression grew wary. In her experience, wealthy people's gratitude often came with strings attached. Expectations that complicated simple lives. That's very kind of you, Mr. Rockford, but Claire was just sharing what she'd learned. We don't expect anything in return. Nevertheless, I insist, Rockford continued. Perhaps a scholarship fund for Claire's education. A girl with this kind of analytical ability deserves every opportunity to develop her talents. The offer hung in the air like heat lightning, beautiful and potentially dangerous. Claire looked at her mother, sensing the complex emotions playing across Wendy's weathered features. Pride in her daughter's accomplishment war with suspicion about the billionaire's motives and concern about accepting charity from someone who'd spent the afternoon insulting their community. Dale Peterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Rockford. Though, I'd suggest you might want to start by acknowledging that the folks in Silver Lake aren't quite as backward as you seemed to think earlier." The comment struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Crawford's earlier insults to the local community now seemed not just unkind, but profoundly ignorant. He dismissed an entire town's capabilities based on nothing more than geographic prejudice and economic snobbery. "You're absolutely right," he admitted, his voice carrying genuine contrition. "I spoke out of frustration and said things that were both unfair and untrue. The people of Silver Lake have shown more competence in one afternoon than my expensive consultants have demonstrated in 3 weeks." Father Paul Richards appeared in the hangar entrance, drawn by reports that something significant was happening at the airport. As Silver Lake's Catholic priest, he'd learned to pay attention when his community was involved in unusual events, especially those that might require pastoral guidance or conflict resolution. "Good afternoon, folks," he said, his calm presence immediately noticeable in the charged atmosphere. "Dale mentioned there was some excitement down here. I hope everything's working out peacefully." Wendy turned toward the priest, grateful for his familiar presence amid the swirling complexity of the afternoon's events. Father Paul, Claire figured out what was wrong with Mr. Crawford's airplane when all those engineers couldn't solve it. The priest's eyebrows rose as he processed this information. He'd known Claire since her baptism 12 years ago, had watched her grow from a curious toddler into a remarkably bright young girl with an unusual gift for understanding how things worked. But solving problems that stumped professional engineers represented a new level of achievement entirely. "That's quite an accomplishment, Claire," he said warmly. "Your talents continue to amaze me." Nicole Murphy finished documenting the diagnostic findings and approached the group with her laptop displaying the conclusive test results. "The data confirms everything Claire suggested," she announced. "We have a clear restriction in the secondary bleed air system that only manifests under sustained climb conditions. Dr. Allen was already coordinating with his team to begin the repair process. We'll need to drain the system, remove the affected components, and perform a complete inspection and cleaning. Conservative estimate is 6 hours to completion, assuming we don't encounter any complications." Rockford nodded approvingly, then turned back to Claire with an expression that mixed respect and curiosity. "I have a question for you, young lady. Are you planning to pursue a career in aerospace engineering?" Claire considered the question seriously, aware that her answer might have implications beyond simple curiosity. "I like solving mechanical problems and I love working with my hands. But I haven't really thought about what I want to be when I grow up." "Perhaps you should," Rockford suggested. "The aerospace industry needs people who can think outside conventional parameters. Your approach today demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative problem-solving that drives technological advancement." Wendy listened to the conversation with mixed feelings. Part of her was enormously proud of Claire's achievement and excited about the possibilities it might represent. But another part worried about pushing her daughter toward expectations that might overshadow the simple joy she found in understanding how things worked. As the Boeing engineers continued their preparations for the repair work, the small group near the hangar entrance found themselves in an unexpected moment of reflection. The afternoon had challenged assumptions, revealed hidden talents, and forced everyone involved to reconsider their understanding of expertise and intelligence. The Texas sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the airport buildings in shades of amber and gold. In a few hours, Thaddeus Crawford's aircraft would be operational again, ready to carry him back to his world of corporate meetings and financial negotiations. But something fundamental had changed in that hangar. Something that would continue to resonate long after the last diagnostic cable was disconnected and the final repair was completed. Claire Duncan had proven that wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that truth was more powerful than prejudice regardless of age or economic circumstances. The repair work began with methodical precision. As evening shadows stretched across the hangar floor, Dr. Allen's team had divided into specialized units, each responsible for specific aspects of the bleed air system inspection. The sophisticated diagnostic equipment continued monitoring engine parameters, while mechanics carefully disassembled components to locate the exact source of the restriction. Claire remained at the security perimeter, reluctant to leave despite her mother's gentle suggestions that they head home for dinner. The unfolding repair process fascinated her in ways that textbooks never could, each step revealing new layers of complexity in aircraft systems she'd only read about in technical manuals. Austin Baker jogged into the hangar, his bicycle helmet dangling from one hand and sweat beading on his forehead from the ride across town. At 13, he was Claire's closest friend and frequent partner in mechanical adventures around Silver Lake. Word had spread through the small community that something extraordinary was happening at the airport. Claire, my dad heard at the hardware store that you figured out what was wrong with some rich guy's airplane. Austin said breathlessly, his excitement palpable. Is it true? Did you really stump a bunch of engineers? I just made a suggestion based on something Mom taught me, Claire replied, though her eyes sparkled with pride. They're testing it now to see if I was right. Austin peered through the hangar, opening at the cluster of professionals working around the sleek aircraft. That's incredible. Wait until the kids at school hear about this. You're going to be famous. The prospect of unwanted attention at school made Claire uncomfortable. She'd always preferred working quietly in her mother's garage to being the center of classroom discussions. Fame seems like a complication she hadn't considered when offering her theory about the engine problem. Henrietta Rockford's taxi pulled up outside the hangar just as the Boeing team made their first significant discovery. Thaddeus' 74-year-old mother emerged from the vehicle with the deliberate movements of someone whose arthritis made every step a calculated decision. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple blue dress suggested someone more concerned with comfort than fashion. She'd driven 3 hours from her retirement community in Austin after receiving Thaddeus' unexpected phone call describing the day's events. The conversation had been their first meaningful contact in over 2 years. A breach that had begun with disagreements about his business practices and widened into complete estrangement. Mrs. Rockford Dale Peterson approached the elderly woman with respectful courtesy. Your son mentioned you might be coming. Can I help you with anything? Henrietta studied the scene before her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I came to meet the young lady who apparently taught my son a lesson in humility. That's not something that happens very often. Her gaze found Claire immediately, recognizing something familiar in the girl's intense focus on the mechanical work proceeding inside the hangar. Henrietta had been a high school mathematics teacher for 43 years before retirement, and she'd learned to identify genuine intellectual curiosity from across a crowded classroom. You must be Claire, she said, approaching the security tape with careful steps. I'm Henrietta Rockford, and I'm very pleased to meet you. Claire looked up at the elderly woman, surprised by the warmth in her voice. Hello, Mrs. Rockford. Are you related to Mr. Rockford? He's my son, but we don't spend much time together these days, Henrietta admitted with a thoughtful smile. I taught mathematics for most of my adult life, and I've always believed that intelligence comes in many forms. Today, you've proven that point beautifully. Inside the hangar, Nicole Murphy called out with excitement in her voice. We found it. There's a small piece of metal debris lodged in the secondary manifold inlet. Looks like it broke off from somewhere else in the system and migrated to this location. Dr. Allen examined the foreign object through a magnifying glass, noting its size and composition. Probably a manufacturing defect that worked loose during normal operations, small enough to allow partial flow, but positioned perfectly to create the restriction we observed during climb conditions. Thaddeus Rockford moved closer to inspect the debris that had caused 3 weeks of delays and millions of dollars and lost business opportunities. The object was barely larger than a pencil eraser, yet its strategic location had completely mystified his expensive team of experts. How did you know to look there? He asked Claire directly, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. What made you think of the bleed air system specifically? Claire glanced at her mother before answering, drawing confidence from Wendy's encouraging nod. Mom told me about a similar problem she encountered years ago. When you described the symptoms, it sounded exactly like what she dealt with. I just remembered her story and thought maybe the same thing was happening here. Henrietta Rockford listened to this exchange with growing admiration for the young girl's reasoning process. As a mathematics teacher, she'd spent decades trying to help students understand that problem-solving often required drawing connections between seemingly unrelated information. Claire had demonstrated that skill naturally without formal training or academic pressure. That's excellent analytical thinking, Henrietta observed. You took information from one context and applied it to a completely different situation. Many adults struggle with that kind of conceptual transfer. Wendy felt a flush of pride at the compliment to her daughter's abilities, but also a growing concern about the attention Claire was receiving. In your experience, sudden fame could be as dangerous as it was flattering, especially for a 12-year-old girl who'd always lived quietly in a small Texas town. We should probably head home soon, Wendy suggested gently. It's getting late. And you have school tomorrow. Actually, Thaddeus interrupted. I was hoping Claire might stay to observe the completion of the repair. If she's interested in aerospace engineering, this could be valuable educational experience. The offer created an unexpected dilemma. Claire was clearly fascinated by the repair process and eager to learn more about aircraft systems. But Wendy worried about encouraging her daughter's involvement with people whose lives operated on a completely different scale from their own simple existence in Silver Lake. Father Paul Richards sensed the family's uncertainty and stepped closer to offer his perspective. Perhaps this could be a learning opportunity, he suggested diplomatically. Claire shown remarkable insight today. and understanding how her suggestion is implemented might reinforce the value of following through on good ideas. Austin looked between Claire and the adults, sensing that his friend was at the center of something much larger than he'd initially understood. "Are you going to become an engineer now?" he asked her directly. "I don't know," Claire answered honestly. "I like solving problems, but I've never thought about making it my job. I just wanted to help because the puzzle seemed interesting." Her response impressed Henrietta even more than her technical insight had. The girl approached complex problems with genuine curiosity rather than ego or ambition, a quality that Henrietta had rarely encountered in her decades of teaching bright students. The Boeing repair team worked with increasing efficiency as they located and removed all traces of debris from the bleed air system. Each component was inspected, cleaned, and tested before reassembly, ensuring that no similar problems would recur during future operations. System flush complete, Brad Wilson announced all components show normal flow characteristics were ready to begin reassembly and final testing. Dr. Allen coordinated the rebuilding process while maintaining constant communication with Boeing's engineering headquarters in Seattle. The unusual nature of the problem and its ultimate solution would require detailed documentation for future reference and possible design modifications. Mickey Campbell, Silver Lake's most experienced aircraft mechanic, appeared in the hangar entrance carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing his characteristic oil-stained coveralls. At 68, he'd been working on aircraft longer than most of the Boeing engineers had been alive, and his reputation for solving unusual problems was legendary throughout Central Texas. "Heard there was some excitement down here," he said, his growly voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through decades of skilled work. Dale mentioned that young Claire figured out something the college boys couldn't handle. Thaddeus Rockford turned toward the newcomer, recognizing immediately that Mickey represented the kind of practical expertise he'd dismissed so carelessly earlier in the day. The older man's confident bearing and obvious knowledge commanded respect in ways that degrees and certifications never could. "Mr. Campbell, I presume," Rockford extended his hand toward Mickey, "I owe you and everyone in this community an apology for my earlier comments. I spoke out of frustration and said things that were both ignorant and insulting." Mickey accepted the handshake with measured courtesy, his callous grip firm but not aggressive. "We all say things we regret when we're upset, Mr. Rockford. The important thing is recognizing when we're wrong and trying to do better." The simple wisdom in Mickey's response struck Rockford with unexpected force. He'd spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who told him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than offering honest perspective on his behavior and decisions. Henrietta watched her son's interaction with Mickey Campbell with cautious optimism. She had spent years hoping that Thaddeus might rediscover the humility and respect for others that had characterized his youth before wealth and power had insulated him from the consequences of his actions. As the repair work continued, an informal gathering developed near the hangar entrance. Claire found herself at the center of conversations about education, problem solving, and the nature of expertise. Adults who'd never paid particular attention to her before were suddenly interested in her thoughts and opinions. The attention was flattering, but also overwhelming. She'd always been most comfortable working quietly with her hands, solving problems through trial and error rather than explaining her reasoning to groups of interested observers. The spotlight felt uncomfortably bright after a lifetime of peaceful anonymity. "I think I'd like to go home now," she whispered to her mother, fatigue and social exhaustion finally overcoming her curiosity about the repair process. Wendy nodded understandingly, recognizing her daughter's need to process the day's extraordinary events and familiar surroundings. "We'll head out in a few minutes, sweetheart. Let me just thank these folks for being so kind to you." As the sun disappeared behind the western horizon, the lights inside the hangar created pools of yellow illumination against the gathering darkness. The repair work would continue for several more hours, but Claire Dunan's role in the day's drama was essentially complete. She'd identified a problem that had stumped experts, challenged assumptions about age and expertise, and forced a powerful man to confront his own prejudices. But perhaps most importantly, she'd remained true to herself throughout the experience, approaching the challenge with the same quiet curiosity and practical wisdom that had always characterized her interactions with the mechanical world around her. The Duncan family's modest two-bedroom house sat on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the town square, where Silver Lake's founding fathers had planted oak trees that now towered over the courthouse lawn. Claire's bedroom walls displayed aviation posters alongside hand-drawn diagrams of engine components, creating a shrine to mechanical curiosity that reflected her deepest passions. Wendy tucked her daughter into bed an hour later than usual. The evening's extraordinary events having disrupted their normal routine completely, Claire's mind buzzed with replaying conversations and technical details, making sleep seem like an impossible goal despite her physical exhaustion. "Mom, do you think I did the right thing today?" Claire asked quietly, her voice carrying uncertainty that hadn't been present during her confident diagnosis at the airport. "Everyone's making such a big deal about it, but I just said what seemed obvious." Wendy sat on the edge of the narrow bed, smoothing Claire's dark hair with gentle fingers. Sweetheart, you shared your knowledge to help solve a problem. That's always the right thing to do. What worries you about it? Mr. Rockford wants to do things for me like pay for college or something. And that lady, his mother, kept talking about how smart I am. It makes me feel weird, like they expect me to be something special all the time. The concern in her daughter's voice triggered protective instincts that Wendy had honed during 12 years of single parenthood. She'd worked hard to give Claire a normal childhood despite their financial limitations, and the sudden intrusion of wealthy benefactors threatened that carefully maintained stability. You don't have to be anything except yourself, Wendy said firmly. What you did today was wonderful, but it doesn't change who you are or what you want from life. Nobody has the right to put expectations on you that you didn't choose for yourself. Meanwhile, 2 mi away in Silver Lake's only luxury hotel, Thaddeus Rockford sat across from his estranged mother in the small restaurant that served guests and curious locals with equal indifference. Their conversation represented the first extended discussion they'd shared in more than 2 years. A tentative bridge across the chasm that had opened between them. I've been thinking about what happened today, Thaddeus admitted, stirring his coffee absently. That little girl made me realize how arrogant I've become. When did I start thinking that money and position made me smarter than everyone else? Henrietta studied her son's face, searching for genuine self-reflection beneath the surface contrition. You started changing when the business took off. Success became your identity instead of your achievement. You forgot that being wealthy doesn't make you wise. The observation stung because of its accuracy. Thaddeus had built his technology empire through legitimate innovation and hard work. But somewhere along the way, he began confusing financial success with personal superiority. Today's humbling experience had cracked that armor of assumed knowledge. I insulted an entire community because they didn't fit my narrow definition of expertise. He continued. I dismissed a 12-year-old girl's insights because I couldn't imagine that someone her age might know something I didn't. The question now is what you plan to do about it. Henrietta replied, recognizing a mistake is just the first step. The real work comes in changing your behavior and making amends for the harm you've caused. At the Silver Lake County Sheriff's Office, Frank Carter finished his evening patrol report while considering the unusual call he'd received from Dale Peterson about the airport incident. As a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, Frank had developed reliable instincts about people and situations that might require official attention. The presence of a billionaire in their small community naturally raised concerns about security and unwanted media attention. But more immediately, Frank worried about the pressure that sudden fame might place on the Duncan family, particularly young Claire. His phone rang with the distinctive tone he'd assigned to important calls. Judge Gloria Wells's voice carried the crisp authority that had made her one of the most respected jurists in Central Texas. Frank, I've been hearing interesting stories about events at the airport today. Something about little Claire Duncan solving an engineering problem that stumped a team of professionals. That's what I'm told, Your Honor. I haven't had a chance to get all the details yet. But it sounds like she identified the source of some mechanical problem with a private aircraft. Judge Wells had known Claire since the girl was 6 years old when Wendy had brought her to the courthouse during school breaks while handling paperwork related to her ex-husband's delinquent child support payments. The child's quiet intelligence and obvious mechanical aptitude had impressed the judge even then. Unconcerned about what this kind of attention might mean for that family, Judge Wells continued, wealthy people sometimes have good intentions, but they don't always understand the complexities of inserting themselves into other people's lives. The conversation reflected a protective instinct that ran deep in Silver Lake's community leadership. They'd seen outsiders arrive before with grand plans and generous offers, only to disappear when their attention shifted to other interests, leaving local families to deal with the disrupted expectations and changed circumstances. Back at the airport, the repair work had progressed to final system testing. Dr. Allen's team methodically verified that all components were functioning within specifications, while sophisticated diagnostic equipment monitored every aspect of the engine's performance under simulated operational conditions. Nicole Murphy coordinated the test sequence from her mobile workstation, her confidence in Claire's diagnosis now complete after seeing the physical evidence of the restriction. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about questioning assumptions and considering unconventional sources of insight. Beginning final climb simulations, she announced to the assembled technicians, all monitoring stations report ready status. The Gulfstream's engines responded smoothly to the electronic commands, producing full power while maintaining normal operating temperatures and pressures. The Bleat air system showed perfect flow characteristics at every altitude simulation, confirming that the restriction had been completely eliminated. Derek Thompson, Rockford's personal assistant, arrived at the hangar in a rental sedan, his expensive suit incongruous among the work clothes and coveralls worn by everyone else present. He'd driven from Dallas after receiving urgent instructions to coordinate the aircraft's return to service and handle any media inquiries that might arise from the day's events. Mr. Rockford, I have prepared press statements about the successful resolution of the maintenance issue, Derek said, consulting his tablet computer. I've also arranged for interviews with several aviation publications about the innovative diagnostic approach your team employed. Dr. Allen looked up from his testing station with surprise. Press statements. I'm not sure that's necessary. This was a routine maintenance issue that happened to require non-standard diagnostic procedures. Nothing about today was routine, Derek replied smoothly. The failure of conventional diagnostics, the involvement of local personnel, the unusual solution path. It's exactly the kind of story that generates positive publicity for Rockford Industries. The prospect of media attention sent alarm bells through everyone present who understood the implications for Claire and her family. Mickey Campbell set down his coffee cup with deliberate force, his expression darkening as he considered the assistant's plans. Now hold on there, son, Mickey said, his voice carrying decades of earned authority. That little girl didn't solve your problem to become some kind of publicity stunt for your boss. She helped because she saw someone in trouble and wanted to offer what she knew. Derek's patronizing smile faltered as he encountered unexpected resistance from someone he'd assumed would be easily managed. I'm sure she'd be honored to be recognized for her contribution. This could open doors for her education and future career opportunities. What it could do is turn her life upside down, Mickey replied firmly. Fame's a dangerous thing for adults, let alone children. Maybe you ought to think about what's best for her instead of what's best for your publicity campaign. The confrontation highlighted a fundamental conflict between two completely different value systems. Derek represented a world where everything was potential marketing material, where human interest stories were commodities to be harvested and distributed for maximum corporate benefit. Mickey represented a community that prioritized protecting its own, especially children, from exploitation by outsiders. Thaddeus Crockford's arrival back at the hangar interrupted the increasingly tense discussion. His conversation with his mother had left him in a reflective mood, more aware of the unintended consequences that his presence might have for the Duncan family. Derek, I appreciate your efficiency, but I don't think press statements are appropriate in this situation, he said quietly. This is a private matter involving a local family, not a corporate publicity opportunity. His assistant's surprise was evident. Sir, this story has significant positive potential for the company's image, a heartwarming narrative about recognizing talent in unexpected places, supporting education in underserved communities, which is exactly why we're not going to exploit it. Thaddeus replied with finality. Sometimes the right thing to do is the opposite of what generates the most attention. The decision represented a significant departure from his usual approach to public relations, which typically involved maximizing exposure for any event that reflected positively on his business interests. But today's experience had forced him to consider perspectives beyond immediate corporate advantage. Dr. Allen completed the final diagnostic sequence and began powering down the test equipment. All systems show normal operation across the full performance envelope, he announced. The aircraft is cleared for return to service. The successful completion of the repair work should have been cause for celebration. But the earlier discussion about media attention had cast a shadow over the achievement. Everyone present understood that Claire's role in solving the problem made her vulnerable to unwanted scrutiny that could fundamentally alter her quiet life in Silver Lake. Father Paul Richards, who had remained quietly observant throughout the evening's events, stepped forward to address the group. Perhaps we should consider what Claire herself would want before making any decisions about publicity or recognition. She's the one most affected by whatever we choose to do. The suggestion carried moral weight that even Derek Thompson couldn't easily dismiss. As the evening wound down and preparations began for departing the airport, the question of how to handle the broader implications of the day's events remained unresolved, creating an undercurrent of tension that would continue to influence future interactions between the various parties involved. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Duncan household before Claire had finished her breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. Denise Coleman, an investigative journalist from the Austin American-Statesman, had driven 2 hours through pre-dawn darkness after receiving a tip about the airport incident from a contact in the aviation industry. She knocked on the front door with the persistent rhythm of someone accustomed to pursuing reluctant interview subjects. Her press credentials and digital recorder were ready, along with a notebook filled with preliminary research about Silver Lake's demographics and economic challenges. Wendy answered the door in her bathrobe, immediately wary of the stranger's professional demeanor and obvious purpose. "Can I help you, Mrs. Duncan? I'm Denise Coleman from the Austin American-Statesman. I'm hoping to speak with you and your daughter about yesterday's events at the airport. I understand Claire played a significant role in solving a complex engineering problem." The journalist's presence confirmed Wendy's worst fears about the previous day's publicity. She'd hoped that the incident would remain a local story, something the community could handle internally without external interference. "I'm sorry, but we're not interested in talking to reporters," Wendy said firmly, beginning to close the door. "My daughter's just a child, and we prefer to keep our private lives private." Denise placed her hand gently against the door frame, not blocking it, but indicating her persistence. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Duncan, but this story could inspire other young people to pursue science and engineering careers. Claire's achievement deserves recognition." From the kitchen table, Claire could hear the conversation and felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She'd barely slept the previous night, troubled by dreams of crowds and cameras and people asking questions she couldn't answer. The reality of a reporter at their door made those nightmares seem prophetic. "Mom, I don't want to talk to her," Claire called out, her voice carrying a note of panic that immediately activated Wendy's protective instincts. "You heard my daughter," Wendy said to the journalist. "Please leave our property." Denise reluctantly stepped back from the doorway, but she didn't return to her car immediately. Instead, she called out loudly enough for Claire to hear. "Claire, I just want people to know how amazing you are. You've done something that could help other girls believe in themselves." The emotional manipulation in the reporter's words wasn't lost on Wendy, who had encountered similar tactics during her divorce proceedings years earlier. People who claimed to act in Claire's best interests while pursuing their own agendas. "If you don't leave immediately, I'm calling the sheriff," Wendy warned, her voice hardening with resolve. Across town at Rosie Bennett's diner, the morning coffee crowd buzzed with excited conversation about the previous day's events. Word had spread through Silver Lake social networks with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve, creating a mixture of pride and protective concern among the locals. Helen Garcia, the diner's owner, wiped down tables while listening to fragments of conversation from various booths. At 63, she'd lived in Silver Lake her entire life and understood better than most how quickly outside attention could disrupt the community's careful equilibrium. "I heard that billionaire wants to send Claire to some fancy school," Betty Chloe Harris was saying to her companion at the corner table as the town's unofficial information exchange center. Betty Chloe collected and distributed rumors with the efficiency of a social media algorithm. "That might not be the blessing it sounds like," replied Eleanor Whitman, Silver Lake's unofficial historian and a retired librarian who understood the value of measured response to dramatic changes. "Sometimes opportunities come with prices that aren't immediately obvious." Mickey Campbell entered the diner carrying the morning newspaper, his expression grim as he approached Helen's counter. "You see this?" he asked, spreading the Austin paper's front page for her inspection. The headline read, "12-year-old girl solves aviation mystery that stumped Boeing engineers," accompanied by a stock photo of a private jet and a smaller image of Silver Lake's town square. The article, written by a different reporter who had compiled the story from second-hand sources, contained several factual errors and sensationalized details that made the incident sound more dramatic than it had actually been. "This is exactly what I was worried about," Mickey muttered, scanning the article's content. "They're making it sound like Claire's some kind of miracle child instead of a smart kid who remembered something her mama taught her." Helen read over his shoulder, her concern growing with each paragraph. The article portrayed Silver Lake as a backward community where Claire's intelligence was unusual and unexpected, reinforcing exactly the kind of stereotypes that residents had been combating for decades. "We need to do something about this before it gets worse," Helen decided. "Maybe call a town meeting or something, figure out how to protect that family from all this attention." At Silver Lake Elementary School, Principal Janet Foster was already dealing with the first wave of media inquiries about Claire's academic record and extracurricular activities. 3 different news organizations had called before 8 o'clock seeking information about the girl's performance and any signs of exceptional ability that teachers might have observed. "I'm sorry, but we don't discuss individual students with media representatives," Principal Foster told the latest caller, a television producer from Dallas, who was planning a feature story about gifted children in rural communities. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, Claire's 6th-grade teacher, knocked on the principal's office door with obvious urgency. "Janet, I've had 2 reporters try to corner me in the parking lot this morning. They want to know about Claire's grades, her behavior, whether she's ever shown signs of being a prodigy." The pressure was exactly what Principal Foster had feared when she'd first heard about the airport incident. Public schools had strict policies about protecting student privacy, but those protections could be overwhelmed when media attention reached sufficient intensity. "We need to send a message to all our teachers," Principal Foster decided. "No one discusses Claire or any other student with reporters, regardless of how they frame the request. And we should probably call Wendy Duncan to make sure she knows what's happening here." Meanwhile, at the Silver Lake Regional Airport, Sheriff Frank Carter was dealing with his own set of complications. 3 news vans had arrived during the night, their crews setting up equipment and preparing for live broadcasts about the girl genius of Silver Lake. Dale Peterson met the sheriff at the airport entrance, his frustration evident as he gestured toward the media circus developing in the parking area. They showed up around 6 o'clock this morning. Keep asking me to recreate yesterday's events, wanting to know exactly what Claire said and how the engineers reacted. Any of them try to get inside the restricted areas? Frank asked, mentally calculating the additional security measures that might be necessary. Not yet. But they keep pushing the boundaries. That blonde reporter from Channel 8 tried to convince me that the public has a right to know the full story. Frank's experience with media management was limited to traffic accidents and the occasional petty crime, but he understood enough about journalism to recognize when a story was spiraling beyond local control. The arrival of multiple news crews suggested that Claire's achievement was being positioned as a much larger narrative about education, gender equality, and rural American values. I'm going to talk to Judge Wells about getting some kind of protective order. Frank decided that family didn't ask for this attention and they shouldn't have to deal with harassment in their own hometown. Back at the hangar, Dr. Allen was conducting final pre-flight inspections while fielding phone calls from Boeing's corporate communications department. The company was interested in the unusual diagnostic approach that had solved the problem, but they were also concerned about potential liability issues if their standard procedures were perceived as inadequate. The solution was unconventional but entirely within accepted maintenance practices. Dr. Allen explained to his supervisor in Seattle. The local personnel simply applied knowledge that our diagnostic protocol didn't encompass. Thaddeus Rockford arrived at the airport earlier than planned, hoping to depart before the media attention intensified further. His conversation with Henrietta the previous evening had convinced him that his continued presence in Silver Lake was becoming problematic for the Duncan family. He found Derek Thompson coordinating with the news crews despite explicit instructions to avoid publicity about the incident. The assistant was providing background information about Rockford Industries and positioning the story as an example of corporate social responsibility. Derek, what part of no publicity did you not understand? Thaddeus demanded, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that Derek had learned to fear during their professional relationship. Sir, the story is already out there. I'm simply trying to ensure that our company's role is portrayed accurately. These reporters are going to write something regardless of our cooperation. The explanation contained enough truth to be plausible, but Thaddeus recognized the underlying motivation. Derek's career advancement depended on generating positive media coverage for Rockford Industries, making him constitutionally unable to resist an opportunity like Claire's story. You're fired, Thaddeus said quietly. Clean out your materials and find your own transportation back to Dallas. The dismissal shocked Derek into momentary silence. He'd worked for Rockford Industries for 6 years, building what he thought was a secure position based on his ability to manage public relations challenges. Sir, I think you're making a mistake. This story could position the company as a leader in supporting STEM education for underserved communities. The mistake would be continuing to employ someone who can't follow explicit instructions about protecting a child's privacy. Thaddeus replied, your termination is effective immediately. As Derek gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, Thaddeus approached the news crews with a prepared statement that he hoped would redirect attention away from Claire and her family. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your interest in yesterday's maintenance issue, but I want to clarify that this was a routine problem that was resolved through standard aerospace industry procedures. No individual deserves special recognition for participating in a collaborative diagnostic process. The statement was deliberately misleading and completely inaccurate, but Thaddeus hoped it would reduce the perceived newsworthiness of Claire's contribution. He was prepared to sacrifice his own credibility to protect a 12-year-old girl from unwanted attention. However, his efforts came too late to prevent the momentum that had already built around the story. Multiple news organizations had invested resources in covering the incident, and they weren't prepared to abandon their investment based on one person's attempt to downplay the events. As Thaddeus' aircraft prepared for departure, the question of how to protect Claire Duncan from the consequences of her own intelligence remained unresolved, creating tensions that would continue to challenge both the local community and the various outsiders whose lives had been touched by a young girl's simple desire to help solve a problem. Judge Gloria Wells convened an emergency session in her chambers at 10 o'clock that morning, summoning Sheriff Carter, Principal Foster, and Mayor Robert Sullivan to address the escalating media situation. The ornate courthouse office, with its leather-bound law books and mahogany desk, provided a fortress of legal authority against the chaos developing throughout Silver Lake. This has gone far enough, Judge Wells declared, her voice carrying the accumulated authority of 30 years on the bench. I will not allow a child in my jurisdiction to be harassed by reporters seeking sensational stories. Mayor Sullivan, a soft-spoken insurance agent who had never expected his largely ceremonial position to involve crisis management, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, Gloria, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure we have the legal authority to restrict journalists from public areas. We have the authority to protect the welfare of minors, Judge Wells replied firmly. And we have the obligation to ensure that our community isn't disrupted by outside interests that have no stake in our long-term well-being. Sheriff Carter consulted his notebook where he documented the morning's escalating incidents. 3 more news crews arrived in the past hour. Channel 12 from Houston, something called Education Weekly, and a freelance documentary filmmaker who claims he's making a movie about gifted children in rural America. The proliferation of media attention had transformed Silver Lake's quiet streets into something resembling a carnival midway. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, creating a cacophony of speculation and misinformation that bore little resemblance to the actual events at the airport. Principal Foster leaned forward in her chair, her concern evident, the schools being overwhelmed with requests for information about Claire's academic record. These people seem to think we should violate federal privacy laws just because their story might inspire other children. What about Thaddeus Rockford? Judge Wells asked. Has he departed yet? His aircraft left about an hour ago, Sheriff Carter confirmed. But before he went, he made a statement to the media trying to downplay Claire's role in solving the problem. Didn't seem to have much effect on their enthusiasm for the story. Through the courthouse windows, they could see reporters setting up equipment on the town square, transforming the peaceful gathering place into a staging area for live broadcasts. The intrusion felt like an invasion to residents who had chosen Silver Lake precisely because it offered refuge from the pace and pressure of larger communities. At the Duncan house, Wendy had called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, unwilling to leave Claire alone while reporters continued circling their neighborhood like persistent predators. The phone had been ringing constantly until Wendy finally unplugged it from the wall. Claire sat at the kitchen table working on homework, but her concentration was fractured by the periodic appearance of news crews driving slowly past their house. Each time a van stopped outside, she felt her anxiety spike, wondering if this would be the moment when someone ignored her mother's warnings and approached their front door. "Mom, can we go visit Uncle Sam?" Claire asked quietly. "Maybe stay at his house until this all calms down." Wendy considered the suggestion seriously. Her brother's ranch was 40 mi outside town, far enough from Silver Lake to provide genuine refuge from the media attention. But running away felt like surrendering their right to live peacefully in their own community. "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's give it another day or two and see if things settle down naturally." Austin Baker appeared at their back door, having ridden his bicycle through the alley to avoid the reporters stationed on Elm Street. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious concern as Wendy led him into the kitchen. "Claire, it's crazy out there," he said breathlessly. "Mrs. Henderson from Channel 8 tried to get me to talk about what you're like at school. She kept asking if you've always been really smart or if this came out of nowhere." The idea that strangers were questioning her friends about her personality and abilities made Claire feel exposed in ways she'd never experienced before. Her quiet life had been built on the assumption that her private thoughts and capabilities were exactly that. "Private? What did you tell her?" Claire asked. "I told her to leave me alone," Austin replied with obvious pride. "My dad says reporters are like vultures, and you shouldn't feed them or they'll keep coming back." Meanwhile, at Rosie Bennett's diner, an impromptu community meeting was developing as concerned residents gathered to discuss the situation. Helen Garcia had closed the restaurant to outside customers, creating a safe space where locals could coordinate their response to the media invasion. Mickey Campbell stood near the coffee station, his weathered hands gesturing emphatically as he addressed the assembled group. "We need to circle the wagons around that family. Claire did something wonderful and now these vultures want to pick her apart for entertainment." Father Paul Richards nodded in agreement from his position near the window where he'd been watching reporters interview passers-by on the street. "This is exactly what Jesus warned about when he said to protect the innocent. We have a moral obligation to shield the child from exploitation." Henrietta Rockford entered the diner quietly, her presence causing a momentary hush as residents wondered about her intentions. She'd remained in Silver Lake overnight despite her son's departure, driven by a growing sense of responsibility for the chaos that his presence had inadvertently created. "Mrs. Rockford," Helen Garcia said cautiously, "were you here as Thaddeus' representative, or as someone concerned about Claire's welfare?" "I'm here as a retired teacher who's seen too many bright children damaged by adult expectations and attention they never asked for," Henrietta replied firmly. "My son's involvement in this situation was the catalyst. But now it's up to all of us to protect that little girl from the consequences." Her unexpected alliance with the community surprised several residents who had assumed that wealthy outsiders would automatically support the media attention as beneficial publicity for Silver Lake. Henrietta's perspective as an educator gave her unique credibility in discussions about Claire's well-being. "What do you suggest we do?" asked Carl Martinez, a local mechanic who had worked with Wendy Duncan on several projects over the years. "We stopped cooperating with the media entirely," Henrietta said. "No interviews. No background information, no cute anecdotes about Claire's childhood. We make it clear that this community protects its children, regardless of what outsiders might consider newsworthy. The suggestion resonated with the assembled residents who had been struggling to find an effective response to the persistent reporters. Individual refusals to cooperate had been largely ignored, but a coordinated community-wide silence might force the media to seek stories elsewhere. Dr. Allen called Wendy Dunnan's home phone from his hotel room, wanting to express his personal gratitude for Claire's contribution to solving the aircraft problem. When the busy signal indicated that the phone had been disconnected, he decided to drive to the Duncan house directly. He arrived to find 2 news vans parked on the street and a reporter attempting to peer through the front windows. The scene triggered his protective instincts as a father of 3 daughters, all of whom were close to Claire's age. "Excuse me," he said to the reporter, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I think you should leave this family alone." The journalist, a young man from a Dallas television station, turned with obvious annoyance at the interruption. "Sir, this is a public street and we have First Amendment rights to gather information about matters of public interest." "This is a 12-year-old child's home," Dr. Allen replied firmly, "and your presence here constitutes harassment of a minor. I suggest you find somewhere else to exercise your constitutional rights." The reporter's aggressive response revealed the entitled attitude that had been driving much of the media coverage. Stories about Claire were being treated as commodity content rather than sensitive reporting about a young person's life. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you are, but this kid is news whether you like it or not." She embarrassed a team of Boeing engineers, and people want to know how that happened. Dr. Allen's patience evaporated completely. "I'm Dr. Gregory Allen, the lead engineer on that team, and I'm telling you that Claire Duncan deserves privacy and respect, not exploitation by people who see her as entertainment." His identification as one of the principals in the original story should have given his words additional weight. But the reporter's reaction suggested that Dr. Allen's perspective was simply another angle to be pursued rather than expert opinion to be respected. "Dr. Allen, perfect timing. Can you give us an on-camera interview about how it felt to be shown up by a little girl? Our viewers would love to hear your perspective on what went wrong with your team's diagnostic process." The casual cruelty in the reporter's framing of the question crystallized everything that was wrong with the media coverage. Claire's helpful suggestion was being transformed into a narrative of professional embarrassment and generational conflict that bore no resemblance to the actual events. "No comment," Dr. Allen said tersely, turning away from the camera that had appeared in the reporter's hands. Inside the Duncan house, Claire watched through a crack in the living room curtains as Dr. Allen walked to their front door. She'd been hoping to thank him for treating her suggestions seriously and for defending her family's privacy against the persistent reporters. Wendy answered the door cautiously, recognizing Dr. Allen from the previous day's events at the airport. His presence on their doorstep could mean additional complications or potential support. She couldn't determine which from his expression. "Mrs. Duncan, I wanted to personally thank Claire for her insight into our engine problem," he said quietly. "But more importantly, I wanted you to know that Boeing will not participate in any media coverage that exploits your daughter's contribution." The assurance provided some relief to Wendy's growing anxiety about corporate interests aligning with journalistic sensationalism. Dr. Allen's professional credibility could potentially influence other media coverage if he was willing to advocate for Claire's privacy. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" Wendy asked. "I think Claire would appreciate hearing that from you directly." As Dr. Allen entered their modest home, the contrast between his corporate background and the Duncan family's simple lifestyle became immediately apparent. But rather than creating social awkwardness, the difference seemed to reinforce his respect for Claire's achievement under circumstances far removed from the privileged environment that typically produced engineering prodigies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Lake, as the community continued grappling with the unintended consequences of a young girl's desire to help solve a problem, setting the stage for decisions that would determine whether Claire Duncan could return to the normal childhood that had been disrupted by her own intelligence and compassion. Victoria Blackwell stepped out of her silver Mercedes at precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, her designer heels clicking against the courthouse steps with the measured precision of someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances. As Thaddeus' arranged wife, she had learned about the Silver Lake incident through gossip networks that operated faster than any news organization. Her arrival sent ripples of unease through the assembled reporters who recognized her as a potentially explosive source of information about the Rockford family dynamics. Victoria had built a reputation in Dallas social circles for her willingness to discuss private matters when it served her interests. Mrs. Blackwell called Amanda Cross, an investigative journalist who had been tracking the story's corporate connections. "Can you comment on your husband's involvement in yesterday's events? Did he mention the young girl who solved his aircraft problem?" Victoria paused strategically, allowing cameras to focus on her perfectly composed features before responding. Thaddeus rarely discusses his business failures with me, but I understand he was quite embarrassed by the situation. It must be difficult for a man of his ego to be shown up by a child. The comment was calculated to create exactly the kind of family discord narrative that would keep the story alive for additional news cycles. Victoria's bitter divorce proceedings had been stalled for months over asset disputes, and negative publicity about Thaddeus could provide leverage in their ongoing negotiations. Inside the courthouse, Judge Wells was preparing a temporary restraining order that would establish protective boundaries around the Duncan family and their property. The legal document represented an unusual application of judicial authority, but Gloria Wells had spent 3 decades defending the rights of children in her courtroom. "Sheriff Carter, I want a 50-foot perimeter around the Duncan residence and Claire's school," she instructed while reviewing the restraining order language. "Anyone who violates that boundary can be arrested for criminal trespass and harassment of a minor." The order would not eliminate media coverage entirely, but it would provide the family with breathing space to make decisions about their future without constant surveillance and intrusion. Judge Wells understood that legal solutions could only address symptoms of the problem, not the underlying media appetite for sensational stories. At Silver Lake Elementary, Mrs. Dorothy Kim was dealing with an unprecedented disruption to her classroom routine. 3 of her students had been withdrawn by parents who feared that association with Claire might attract unwanted attention to their own families. The remaining children were distracted by the excitement outside, making normal instruction nearly impossible. "Children, I need everyone to focus on their math worksheets," she said firmly, trying to restore educational order to a situation that had spiraled beyond her experience. "What's happening outside has nothing to do with our learning objectives for today." But 11-year-old Samantha Price raised her hand with obvious excitement. "Mrs. Kim, my mom says Claire is going to be famous and maybe get to meet the president. Is that true?" The question reflected the mythologizing process that had already begun transforming Claire's simple observation into something approaching legend. Each retelling of this story added new details and elevated the significance of her contribution beyond recognition. "Claire is the same person she was 2 days ago, Mrs. Kim replied carefully. She helped solve a problem because she remembered something useful her mother had taught her. That's admirable, but it doesn't make her different from any of you." The teacher's attempt to normalize the situation was undermined by the obvious abnormality of news vans surrounding the school and reporters interviewing parents during pickup hours. Children understood instinctively that something extraordinary was happening regardless of adult attempts to minimize the disruption. Meanwhile, at the Ranch 40 outside Silver Lake, Coach Sam Rodriguez was preparing his property to serve as a temporary refuge for his sister and niece. The isolated location offered genuine privacy, but Sam worried about the message that retreating would send to the community that had always supported his family. His phone rang with a call from Wendy, her voice strained with exhaustion and frustration. "Sam, I think we might need to take you up on that offer. This situation is getting worse instead of better. You know you're always welcome here." Sam replied, though his tone carried concern about the precedent of allowing outside pressure to drive local families from their homes. "But are you sure running away is the right answer? Sometimes standing your ground sends a stronger message." The philosophical question reflected a fundamental disagreement about how to respond to unwanted attention. Wendy's protective instincts favored removing Claire from the source of stress, while Sam's competitive nature as a football coach suggested that retreating would only encourage further pursuit. "I'm not thinking about messages or precedents," Wendy said firmly. "I'm thinking about my 12-year-old daughter who's afraid to leave her own house because strangers want to turn her into some kind of circus act." The conversation highlighted the impossible position that fame had created for the Duncan family. Every decision they made would be interpreted as a response to celebrity status they had never sought and didn't want. Back in Silver Lake, Nicole Murphy had returned to the airport with a laptop full of technical documentation about the previous day's repair work. As the junior engineer who had worked most closely with Claire during the diagnostic process, she felt a professional obligation to provide accurate information about the aircraft maintenance procedures. Dale Peterson met her at the terminal entrance, his expression reflecting the weariness of someone who had been fielding media inquiries for 36 straight hours. "Dr. Murphy, I hope you're not here to talk to those reporters. They've been twisting everything anyone tells them. Actually, I wanted to document the technical aspects of what happened," Nicole replied. "There are lessons here that the aerospace industry needs to understand, but not through sensationalized news coverage." Her academic perspective offered a different approach to preserving the value of Claire's contribution while protecting the girl from exploitation. Professional journals and industry publications could examine the diagnostic methodology without focusing on Claire's personal story. "That sounds like a much better idea than what's been happening," Dale agreed. "Maybe if the technical people get the real story, the entertainment reporters will lose interest and move on to someone else." Father Paul Richards had spent the afternoon visiting parishioners who were struggling with the ethical complexities of the media invasion. Many residents felt torn between pride in Claire's achievement and anger about the disruption to their community's peaceful character. Rosa Martinez, Sheriff Carter's wife and a nurse at the local clinic, expressed the confusion that many felt about the appropriate response. Father, is it wrong to want people to know about Claire's accomplishment? Shouldn't we be proud that one of our children did something so remarkable? Pride in Claire's achievement is entirely appropriate, Father Paul replied thoughtfully. But using a child's accomplishment for adult purposes, whether for publicity, profit, or community promotion, crosses ethical boundaries that we should respect. The moral guidance reflected the Catholic Church's long-standing emphasis on protecting children from exploitation, even when that exploitation was disguised as recognition or opportunity. Father Paul had seen too many families damaged by sudden fame to believe that media attention was inherently beneficial. As evening approached, Judge Wells's restraining order took effect with immediate impact on the media presence around the Duncan home. Sheriff Carter personally served copies to the news crews, establishing clear boundaries that would be enforced through arrests if necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, you now have legal notice that approaching within 50 feet of this residence constitutes criminal trespass. Quote, he announced to the assembled reporters, the same restriction applies to Silver Lake Elementary School during school hours. The legal intervention provided immediate relief to the Duncan family, though it also ensured that the story would continue developing in courtrooms and legal filings rather than simply fading from public attention. Victoria Blackwell's inflammatory comments had already generated additional interest from tabloid publications that specialized in family conflict narratives. Dr. Allen concluded his visit with Claire and Wendy by offering a different kind of support than the financial assistance that Thaddeus had proposed. Bowen has an educational outreach program that provides mentorship opportunities for students interested in aerospace engineering. He explained, if Claire decides she wants to pursue that field, we could arrange for her to work with engineers who understand the importance of privacy and appropriate boundaries. The offer represented a middle ground between ignoring Claire's obvious talents and subjecting her to inappropriate public attention. Professional mentorship could nurture her abilities without creating the celebrity status that had proven so problematic. Claire listened to the conversation with mixed feelings about her future options. The aircraft engine problem had been interesting to solve, but she'd never considered that her mechanical curiosity might lead to specific career expectations from adults who barely knew her. I just like figuring out how things work, she said quietly. I don't know if I want to make it my job when I grow up. Dr. Allen nodded approvingly at her response. The best engineers maintain that sense of curiosity without letting it become an obligation. Whatever you decide to pursue, that natural problem-solving instinct will serve you well. As darkness settled over Silver Lake, the community found itself forever changed by the events of the past 2 days. The media attention would eventually fade, but the questions raised about privacy, exploitation, and the protection of gifted children would continue influencing how the town responded to future encounters with the outside world. Claire Duncan had solved an engineering problem through simple application of knowledge gained from her mother's teachings. But in doing so, she had inadvertently exposed the complex tensions between individual achievement and community values, between recognizing talent and protecting innocence, between celebrating success and preserving the quiet dignity of small-town life that had nurtured her abilities in the first place. 3 weeks after the aircraft incident, Claire had returned to something resembling normal life. Though the experience had left subtle changes in both her perspective and the community's awareness of her abilities, the media circus had largely moved on to other stories. But the underlying questions about talent, privacy, and opportunity remained unresolved beneath Silver Lake's restored surface calm. The morning mail brought an unexpected envelope addressed to Claire in elegant script on letterhead from the National Science Foundation. Wendy examined the official seal with mixture of pride and weariness, having learned to view outside attention with suspicion regardless of its apparent prestige. What do you think it says? Claire asked, studying the formal envelope over her bowl of cereal. At 12, she'd become accustomed to mail that was both exciting and potentially problematic. Wendy opened the letter carefully, her expression shifting from curiosity to amazement as she read the contents. Laurier, they're inviting you to participate in something called the Young Innovators Program. It's a summer camp for students who've demonstrated exceptional problem-solving abilities. The invitation represented exactly the kind of opportunity that educators and parents typically considered invaluable for gifted children. 2 weeks at a research facility in Colorado working alongside other young people who had shown unusual aptitude in science and engineering fields. Do I have to go? Claire asked, her question revealing the ambivalence that had developed about special recognition since the airport incident. It sounds like it might be fun, but I was hoping to spend the summer helping you with aircraft maintenance. Her preference for familiar activities over prestigious opportunities reflected a wisdom beyond her years, understanding instinctively that authentic learning often occurred in ordinary settings rather than specially designed programs for exceptional students. At the Silver Lake Regional Airport, a different kind of opportunity was developing through less formal channels. Captain Pamela Hayes had been visiting the facility regularly since the incident, ostensibly to file reports with FECA investigators, but actually to observe the maintenance operations that had produced such effective problem-solving. As a military pilot with 23 years of experience, Pamela understood aircraft systems from an operational perspective that complemented the mechanical knowledge that Wendy and Claire shared. Her conversations with the Duncan family had revealed fascinating gaps between pilot training and maintenance expertise. "Wendy, I've been thinking about something," Pamela said during her latest visit to the maintenance hangar. "The Air Force has been struggling with retention of experienced maintenance personnel. What if we developed a program that brought civilian mechanics together with military pilots for cross-training?" The suggestion intrigued Wendy, who had always been curious about the operational challenges that pilots faced with aircraft she maintained. "What kind of cross-training are you thinking about?" "Pilots learning enough about maintenance to better communicate problems they observe, and mechanics learning enough about flight operations to understand how their work affects performance in ways that might not be obvious from ground testing." Claire listened to the conversation while organizing tools in her mother's workstation, fascinated by the idea that different types of expertise could be combined to solve problems that neither approach could handle alone. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar black sedan that brought back uncomfortable memories of media attention and outside interference. But instead of reporters or corporate representatives, the vehicle discharged a middle-aged woman in a simple business suit who approached the hangar with obvious nervousness. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I'm looking for Claire Duncan. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen and I'm a mechanical engineering professor at the University of Texas. I was hoping to speak with her about her diagnostic approach." Wendy's protective instincts activated immediately, but Dr. Chen's academic demeanor and respectful approach seemed different from the aggressive journalists who had previously invaded their privacy. "I'm not interested in publicity or media coverage," Dr. Chen continued quickly, recognizing Wendy's weariness. "I'm researching informal learning environments and how practical knowledge gets transmitted outside traditional educational settings." The academic focus offered a more sophisticated perspective on Claire's achievement than the simplistic girl genius narrative that had dominated media coverage. Dr. Chen understood that exceptional problem-solving often resulted from unique combinations of formal education and experiential learning. "What exactly do you want to know?" Wendy asked cautiously. "I'm interested in how Claire learned to recognize patterns that trained engineers missed. Not for publicity purposes, but to understand how we might improve engineering education by incorporating more diverse learning approaches." Claire looked up from her tool organization, intrigued despite her weariness about academic attention. "You mean like figuring out why some problems are hard for people who know a lot about engines?" Dr. Chen's eyes lit up with genuine scholarly excitement. "Exactly. Sometimes expertise can create blind spots that prevent people from seeing obvious solutions. Your approach suggests different ways of analyzing complex systems." The conversation represented a more thoughtful engagement with Claire's abilities than she'd experienced since the initial incident. Dr. Chen was interested in understanding rather than exploiting, and learning rather than promoting. Meanwhile, at Rosie Bennett's diner, Henrietta Rockford had become a regular customer during her extended stay in Silver Lake. Her presence had initially caused curiosity among locals, but her obvious commitment to supporting the community had gradually earned acceptance and even affection. "I've been thinking about establishing a scholarship fund for local students," she mentioned to Helen Garcia during the lunch rush, not specifically for Claire, but for any young person in Silver Lake who wants to pursue higher education. The offer represented a more sustainable approach to supporting local talent than the dramatic gestures that Thaddeus had initially proposed. Henrietta's background as an educator gave her realistic perspective on how to nurture young people without overwhelming them with premature attention. "That's very generous," Helen replied, refilling Henrietta's coffee cup. "Though I suspect some folks might worry about strings attached to that kind of gift." "No strings except academic achievement and good character," Henrietta assured her. "I've seen too many bright children damaged by adult expectations. The goal would be to provide opportunities without creating pressure." Austin Baker burst through the diner's front door with obvious excitement, his bicycle helmet still strapped to his head as he searched for familiar faces among the lunch crowd. "Mrs. Garcia, have you seen Claire today? I just got accepted to that summer robotics camp at the community college and I wanted to tell her the news." His enthusiasm reminded everyone present that exceptional opportunities didn't have to be complicated by fame or controversy. Austin's acceptance to a local program represented exactly the kind of educational advancement that communities could support without attracting unwanted outside attention. She's probably at the airport with her mother, Helen suggested. But Austin, that's wonderful news about the robotics camp. Your parents must be very proud. The conversation highlighted how normal educational achievements could proceed without media circus when they occurred within appropriate institutional frameworks. Austin's success was celebrated by people who knew him personally rather than exploited by strangers seeking compelling content. Back at the airport, Dr. Chen was concluding her conversation with Claire and Wendy by proposing a very different kind of collaboration than anyone had previously suggested. What if Claire participated in some research about learning environments, but as a partner rather than a subject, she proposed? She could help us understand how practical knowledge gets developed while also learning about formal engineering approaches. The suggestion appealed to Claire because it positioned her as a contributor to knowledge rather than a recipient of special treatment. You mean I could help figure out how to teach other people to solve problems? Exactly. Your diagnostic approach suggests insights that could improve how we prepare engineers to handle unusual problems. You'd be helping to develop better educational methods. Wendy appreciated the collaborative framework that Dr. Chen proposed, which seemed to respect Claire's autonomy while providing genuine learning opportunities. What would that involve specifically? Occasional conversations about problem-solving approaches, maybe some visits to the university to observe how engineering students learn. Nothing that would interfere with school or require public attention. The academic partnership offered a middle ground between ignoring Claire's abilities and subjecting her to inappropriate pressure. Dr. Chen understood that 12-year-olds needed time to develop their interests without premature specialization or career expectations. As afternoon faded into evening, Silver Lake had found a new equilibrium that acknowledged Claire's exceptional moment while protecting her right to remain a normal child. The community had learned valuable lessons about fame, privacy, and the importance of nurturing talent without exploiting it. Claire Duncan had solved an aircraft engine problem through simple application of knowledge her mother had shared. But the real achievement had been the community's successful effort to protect her from the consequences of her own intelligence and compassion. The future remained full of possibilities. The National Science Foundation Program, Dr. Chen's research collaboration, Captain Hayes' cross-training initiative, Henrietta's scholarship fund. But for now, Claire was content to organize tools in her mother's workshop, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of honest mechanical work that had taught her everything she needed to know about solving problems that mattered. The aircraft incident had revealed that genius could emerge from unexpected places, and that wisdom often resided in the simplest explanations rather than the most complex theories. But perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that communities possessed the power to protect their children from exploitation while still celebrating their achievements. Silver Lake had found its way through the crisis not through dramatic gestures or legal battles, but through the quiet determination of ordinary people who understood that a child's future was more important than any adult's agenda. Whether that agenda involved publicity, profit, or even well-intentioned recognition that might ultimately prove more harmful than beneficial. 6 months had passed since the aircraft incident when Thaddeus Rockford returned to Silver Lake, driving himself in a modest rental car rather than arriving in corporate luxury. The absence of fanfare was intentional. He'd spent the intervening months reassessing his priorities and relationships, beginning with the painful process of examining his own behavior and its consequences. He found Claire at the public library on a Saturday afternoon, working quietly at a corner table surrounded by books about mechanical engineering and aircraft design. Her mother sat nearby, helping other children with their homework as part of her volunteer commitment to the community literacy program. "Hello, Claire," Thaddeus said softly, approaching their table with obvious uncertainty. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Claire looked up from her reading with surprise, recognizing the man whose aircraft problem had inadvertently changed her life. "Mr. Rockford, I thought you moved away. I had some business to take care of, but I wanted to come back and talk with you and your mother. If that's all right with both of you." Wendy studied Thaddeus carefully, noting the absence of expensive clothing and arrogant demeanor that had characterized his previous visit. 6 months had apparently brought significant changes to the billionaire's perspective and presentation. "What did you want to discuss?" she asked cautiously, still protective despite his more humble approach. Thaddeus pulled out a chair and sat down carefully, his movements reflecting someone who had learned not to assume automatic welcome in other people's spaces. "I wanted to apologize for the disruption my presence caused your family and this community, and I wanted to explain what I've learned from that experience." The apology surprised Claire, who had assumed that wealthy people never admitted mistakes or took responsibility for unintended consequences. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I behaved badly when I was here before. I insulted people who had done nothing wrong, dismissed your mother's expertise, and treated your remarkable problem-solving ability as if it was some kind of amusing novelty rather than genuine intelligence." His words carried the weight of genuine reflection rather than corporate public relations. suggesting that the months away had involved serious self-examination rather than simply waiting for controversy to fade. Claire closed her engineering textbook and considered his apology seriously. I wasn't really mad at you. I was more confused about why everyone made such a big deal about me remembering something Mom taught me. That's part of what I learned, Thaddeus continued. I was so focused on my own problems and frustrations that I couldn't see the real value in what you'd accomplished. You didn't just solve a technical problem, you demonstrated wisdom and humility that I'd forgotten how to recognize. Wendy listened to the conversation with cautious interest, recognizing authenticity in Thaddeus' manner that had been completely absent during his previous visit. What brings you back to Silver Lake now? Several things, actually. I wanted to apologize in person, but I also wanted to share what's happened since I left here. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, placing it carefully on the library table. I've been working with Dr. Chan at the University of Texas to establish a research program that studies how practical knowledge gets transmitted in working communities like Silver Lake. The academic collaboration represented a more sophisticated approach to understanding La's diagnostic success than the simplistic media narratives that had initially dominated coverage of the incident. Dr. Chen told us about that, Claire said. I helped her interview some of the mechanics at the airport about how they learn to solve problems. It was really interesting. The research has already produced insights that are changing how Boeing approaches diagnostic training. Thaddeus explained, your mother's teaching methods are being studied as examples of effective knowledge transfer between generations of technical workers. Wendy looked surprised at the idea that her informal instruction of Claire had academic value worthy of corporate attention. I just shared what I'd learned over the years, nothing special about it. That's exactly what makes it special, Thaddeus replied. Formal training programs often fail to capture the kind of intuitive understanding that you've passed on to Claire. We're learning to incorporate those approaches into professional education. Claire was fascinated by the idea that her learning experience with her mother had broader implications for how other people might be taught. You mean other kids could learn the way I did? We're developing pilot programs that combine formal engineering instruction with mentorship relationships similar to what you've had with your mother. Early results suggest that students who learn through this integrated approach solve complex problems more effectively. The conversation was interrupted by Austin Baker's arrival at the library, his arms full of robotics project materials and his face bright with the satisfaction of successful problem solving. His summer camp experience had evolved into an ongoing partnership with the Community Colleagues Technology Program. Claire, you've got to see what we built in robotics class today, he said excitedly, then stopped short when he noticed that. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Austin, this is Mr. Rockford, Claire said. He's the one whose airplane I helped fix last year. Austin studied Thaddeus with the direct curiosity that characterized 12-year-olds who hadn't yet learned to be intimidated by wealth or status. Cool. Are you here to get Claire to fix something else? The innocent question made Thaddeus smile genuinely for the first time since his arrival. Actually, I'm here to thank her for teaching me something important about humility and respect. That's good, Austin replied matter-of-factly. Claire's really smart, but she's also really nice. You should definitely treat her with respect. The boy's straightforward protection of his friend impressed Thaddeus with its simple clarity about appropriate behavior. Austin possessed the kind of moral confidence that Thaddeus had lost somewhere in his pursuit of financial success. Father Paul Richards entered the library's main room, recognizing Thaddeus despite the dramatic change in his appearance and demeanor. The priest's expression reflected cautious optimism about the billionaire's return to Silver Lake. Mr. Rockford, Father Paul said, approaching their table with characteristic directness. I hope your visit today brings healing rather than disruption to our community. That's my intention, Father. I wanted to make amends for my previous behavior and share how this community's wisdom has influenced positive changes in my business practices. The priest nodded approvingly, recognizing the language of genuine repentance rather than calculated public relations. What kind of changes? We've restructured our hiring practices to value practical experience alongside formal education. We've established partnerships with community colleges in rural areas that had been overlooked by our recruiting efforts. And we've created mentorship programs that pair experienced workers with younger employees. The business reforms represented concrete applications of lessons learned in Silver Lake, suggesting that Thaddeus' transformation involved more than personal growth. His corporation was implementing systemic changes based on insights gained from Claire's diagnostic approach and the community's protective response. Claire listened to the discussion with growing understanding of how her simple observation about the aircraft engine had created ripple effects far beyond Silver Lake's boundaries. You mean what happened here is helping other people learn better? Exactly, Thaddeus confirmed. Your approach to problem solving has become a model for how we train engineers to think creatively about complex systems. But more importantly, this community's response to protecting you has taught us about the importance of nurturing talent without exploiting it. Henrietta Rockford appeared in the library entrance, moving carefully with the assistance of a walking cane that hadn't been necessary during her previous visit. At 75, her arthritis had progressed to the point where extended travel required considerable effort. "Mother," Thaddeus said, rising to help her navigate between the reading tables. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to make the trip. I wouldn't miss the opportunity to see Claire again," Henrietta replied, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her a beloved teacher for 4 decades. "Besides, I have news to share about the scholarship fund." She settled carefully into a chair beside Claire, her eyes bright with satisfaction despite her physical limitations. "We've awarded our first scholarships to 3 local students, including Austin here." Austin's face lit up with surprise and excitement. "Really? I got the scholarship?" "Full tuition for the engineering program at Texas A&M with summer internships at companies that value both academic achievement and practical problem-solving experience." The scholarship represented exactly the kind of sustainable support that communities needed to nurture local talent without creating dependency on outside benefactors. Henrietta had designed the program to reinforce local values while providing genuine educational opportunities. "What about the other scholarships?" Wendy asked, curious about how the selection process had worked. "Maria Santos received support for nursing school and Jake Morrison got funding for aviation maintenance training." Henrietta explained. All 3 students demonstrated the combination of academic ability and community commitment that the program was designed to support. Claire felt genuine happiness for her friends' achievements, recognizing that their success had been earned through consistent effort rather than dramatic single moments. "That's wonderful. They all worked really hard for those opportunities." As the afternoon progressed, the gathering in the library's corner became an informal celebration of how a community had successfully navigated the challenges of sudden fame while protecting its most vulnerable members. Claire's aircraft diagnosis had been the catalyst, but the real achievement had been Silver Lake's collective wisdom in managing the consequences. Thaddeus concluded his visit by presenting the library with a donation that would fund expanded technology resources and educational programs for local children. Unlike his initial dramatic gestures, this gift had been carefully coordinated with community leaders to ensure it served actual needs rather than creating new problems. "Thank you for teaching me that intelligence comes in many forms and that wisdom often resides in the most unexpected places," he said to Claire as he prepared to leave. "You solved my aircraft problem, but more importantly, you helped me solve some problems with my own character." The acknowledgement meant more to Claire than any dramatic gesture or expensive gift could have, because it recognized her contribution while respecting her right to remain a normal child in a community that valued her for who she was rather than what she might become. 1 year after the aircraft incident, Claire Duncan stood in her mother's workshop on a crisp October morning, carefully adjusting the carburetor on a 1952 Cessna that belonged to Tommy Henderson, a crop duster from the neighboring county. The engine repair had been challenging but not impossible, requiring exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that had become Claire's trademark approach to mechanical puzzles. "Try it now, Mr. Henderson," she called out as the pilot prepared to test the engine's performance. The Cessna's engine turned over smoothly, producing the steady rhythm that indicated proper fuel mixture and timing. Tommy Henderson had been skeptical about bringing his aircraft to a 13-year-old mechanic, but Wendy Dunan's reputation had convinced him to trust the family's expertise. "Sounds perfect," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Your mother taught you well, young lady." Claire wiped her hands on a clean rag, satisfied with the morning's work, but already thinking about the algebra homework waiting for her at home. The balance between mechanical projects and academic responsibilities had become natural during the past year, each area of learning informing and strengthening the other. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the airport carrying a leather briefcase filled with documentation from her ongoing research into practical learning environments. Her collaboration with Claire had evolved into a comprehensive study that was attracting attention from engineering schools across the country. "Claire, I have exciting news about the research project," she announced, her academic enthusiasm barely contained. 3 universities have requested permission to adapt your mother's teaching methodology for their programs." The recognition represented validation of Wendy's informal educational approach, transforming what had been simple mother-daughter knowledge sharing into a model for professional instruction. Claire felt proud of her mother's contribution to improving how future engineers would learn. "What does that mean exactly?" Wendy asked, looking up from her inspection of a Piper Cherokee's landing gear assembly. "It means that engineering students will learn through hands-on mentorship relationships similar to what Claire experienced with you. Formal theory combined with practical problem-solving under the guidance of experienced practitioners." Claire listened to the explanation while organizing tools in her mother's workstation, fascinated by the idea that her learning experience was being studied and replicated. "Will the students like learning that way?" Early results suggest they retain information better and develop more creative approaches to solving complex problems, Dr. Chen replied, "Your diagnostic method has become a case study in how intuitive understanding can complement formal analysis." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar black sedan that no longer triggered anxiety or protective responses from the Silver Lake community. Judge Gloria Wells emerged from the vehicle, carrying legal documents that would formalize the final resolution of issues stemming from the media attention that had once threatened to overwhelm the Duncan family. "Good morning, folks," she said, approaching the hangar with the measured dignity that had characterized her 3 decades on the bench. "I have some paperwork that should put an end to any remaining concerns about privacy protection." The legal documents established precedents for protecting minor children from media exploitation in cases involving technical or scientific achievements. Claire's experience had contributed to new guidelines that other communities could use to shield talented young people from unwanted attention. "Does this mean other kids won't have to deal with what I went through?" Claire asked, understanding instinctively that legal protections could prevent future families from experiencing similar disruption. "That's the goal," Judge Wells confirmed. "Your situation helped us identify gaps in existing privacy laws. These new protections should make it much harder for media organizations to harass children who happen to do something newsworthy." Austin Baker arrived at the airport on his bicycle, his A&M engineering textbooks secured in a backpack that had become a familiar sight around Silver Lake. The scholarship program had allowed him to begin college coursework while still living at home, creating an educational pathway that maintained community connections while providing advanced learning opportunities. "Claire, you have to see what we're working on in differential equations," he said excitedly, pulling out a notebook filled with complex mathematical formulas. "Professor Martinez is teaching us to solve engineering problems using some of the same thinking processes you used with that airplane engine." The academic connection between Claire's intuitive approach and formal mathematical methods fascinated her, suggesting that different types of intelligence could be integrated rather than treated as separate categories. Austin's enthusiasm for connecting practical and theoretical knowledge reflected the educational philosophy that Dr. Chen was documenting. Captain Pamela Hayes landed her military transport aircraft at Silver Lake Regional with the precision that had made her one of the Air Force's most respected pilots. Her quarterly visits had become opportunities to evaluate the cross-training program that was now being tested at 3 different military installations. "Wendy, the Pentagon wants to expand the pilot-mechanic collaboration program to 12 more bases," she announced as she secured her aircraft. "The maintenance efficiency improvements have been remarkable." The military application of insights gained from Claire's diagnostic success demonstrated how local wisdom could influence large institutions when those institutions were humble enough to recognize value in unexpected sources. Captain Hayes had become an advocate for incorporating civilian expertise into military training protocols. "What kind of improvements are you seeing?" Wendy asked, genuinely curious about how her teaching methods translated to military environments. "Pilots are reporting problems more accurately because they understand maintenance perspectives, and mechanics are solving issues faster because they comprehend operational requirements. Communication between the two groups has improved dramatically." Claire listened to the discussion while completing final adjustments to Tommy Henderson's carburetor, proud that her family's approach to problem solving was helping people in settings far beyond Silver Lake's boundaries. Father Paul Richards walked across the tarmac carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose community had successfully weathered a significant challenge. His role in protecting Claire from exploitation had reinforced his conviction that moral leadership required active intervention rather than passive observation. "Beautiful morning for flying," he observed, settling into a folding chair that Wendy kept for visitors to her workshop. "Hard to believe it's been a full year since all the excitement began." The anniversary had passed without fanfare or media attention, exactly as the community had hoped when they'd first rallied to protect Claire from unwanted publicity. Silver Lake had returned to its normal rhythm while maintaining the positive changes that had emerged from the crisis. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't said anything about the Blee Air system," Claire mused, considering alternative outcomes to the chain of events that had transformed her quiet life. "You'd still be the same intelligent, compassionate young woman you've always been," Father Paul replied. "The circumstances might have been different, but your character would remain unchanged." Henrietta Crockford's arrival in a taxi marked the conclusion of her regular visits to Silver Lake as her advancing arthritis made travel increasingly difficult. At 76, she decided to relocate permanently to a retirement community closer to her son. But her commitment to the scholarship program would continue through careful administration by local trustees. "Claire, dear, I wanted to say goodbye in person," she said, moving slowly but steadily toward the hangar entrance, "and I wanted you to know how much your wisdom has meant to an old teacher who thought she'd learned everything she needed to know about recognizing talent." The goodbye carried emotional weight that surprised Claire, who had grown fond of the elderly woman's weekly visits and educational insights. Henrietta had become an unofficial grandmother figure, offering perspective and encouragement without creating pressure or expectations. "Will you visit us again?" Claire asked, understanding that practical limitations might make future trips impossible. "In spirit, if not in person," Henrietta replied, "but you have everything you need right here in Silver Lake. Your mother's wisdom, your community support, and most importantly, your own good judgment about what matters in life." As the afternoon progressed, Claire found herself reflecting on the year's experiences and their lasting impact on her understanding of intelligence, community, and responsibility. The aircraft diagnosis had been a single moment of applied knowledge, but its consequences had taught her valuable lessons about the complexity of human relationships and the importance of maintaining perspective amid external pressures. Dr. Chen concluded her visit by presenting Claire with a bound copy of the research study that documented her diagnostic approach and its educational implications. The academic publication represented formal recognition of her contribution to improving engineering education, but it also marked the end of her active participation in the research project. "Thank you for helping us understand how practical wisdom gets transmitted between generations," Dr. Chen said. "Your insights have already influenced how we prepare engineers to think creatively about complex problems." Claire accepted the research publication with pride, understanding that her simple observation about an aircraft engine had contributed to knowledge that would benefit future students and professionals. But she also felt relief that her role as a research subject was complete, allowing her to return fully to the normal life of a 13-year-old girl with mechanical interests and academic responsibilities. As evening approached and the various visitors departed Silver Lake, Claire remained in her mother's workshop, completing routine maintenance on a small aircraft engine while thinking about homework assignments and weekend plans with Austin. The extraordinary year had ended where it began, with a young girl learning about mechanical systems from her mother in a quiet hangar at a small-town airport. The aircraft incident had revealed that genius could emerge from unexpected places and that communities possess the wisdom to protect their children while still celebrating their achievements. But perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that ordinary people could respond to extraordinary circumstances with grace, courage, and the kind of collective wisdom that transforms crisis into opportunity for genuine growth and positive change. Claire Duncan had solved an engineering problem through simple application of knowledge her mother had shared, but the real achievement had been Silver Lake's successful effort to protect her from the consequences of her own intelligence and compassion while ensuring that her insights continued to benefit others in appropriate and sustainable ways. The story had ended not with fame or fortune, but with the quiet satisfaction of work well done and a community strengthened by its commitment to protecting what mattered most. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.